For over 3 centuries, the Dutch East Indies was a sprawling empire. It stretched across 17,000 islands, holding millions under colonial rule. When that empire finally fractured after 1945, the Netherlands didn't leave quietly. Instead, they waged a brutal 4-year military campaign to crush Indonesian independence. Yet, for the next half-century, Dutch history textbooks largely ignored the war, the systematic violence, and the multi-billion-dollar debt forced on the new nation before the Dutch finally departed. This silence was a deliberate construction, a network of euphemisms designed to protect a national myth of colonial decency. The Dutch East Indies was the primary economic engine funding the modern Netherlands. For the elite living in manicured estates like this one, the profits paid for servants, sprawling gardens, and a lifestyle impossible back in Europe. That lifestyle was subsidized by the cultivation system. Starting in 1830, Javanese villagers were forced to dedicate a fifth of their land and labor to growing cash crops, like coffee, sugar, and indigo, instead of food for their own families. In these structured trenches, it was a regime of forced labor. This chart shows how lucrative that extraction became. By the mid-19th century, these colonial profits accounted for roughly a third of the entire Dutch national budget. It financed domestic railways, social security, and an attractive tax system back in the Netherlands. The myth of the Dutch as benevolent colonizers served as a psychological necessity, providing a moral justification for this ongoing economic drainage. That illusion held until World War II. In 1942, the Japanese military occupied the archipelago, rounding up the European administrative class and physically erasing Dutch influence from the public square. The sudden collapse shattered the myth of European military invincibility. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, a massive power vacuum emerged. The Dutch forces had not yet returned, giving local nationalists a brief window to act. On August 17, 1945, nationalist leaders Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta stepped up to a microphone in Jakarta and declared independence for the Republic of Indonesia. For the Indonesian people, this was the birth of a sovereign nation. But in The Hague, a recovering Dutch government saw an illegitimate rebellion that threatened their post-war economic survival. The Dutch government refused to recognize the Republic. Fearing intervention from the newly formed United Nations, they refused to officially use the word war. Instead, they used the term police actions. The language framed the conflict as a domestic matter of restoring order, rather than an international struggle for independence. To carry out this policing, the Netherlands deployed a massive expeditionary force of over 100,000 heavily armed troops. By redefining the conflict as a police operation, the Dutch state attempted to delegitimize Indonesian sovereignty and wage a colonial war under a different name. While politicians in The Hague spoke of restoring order, the heavily militarized reality on the ground was a fierce guerrilla war. Dutch conscripts were sent to reclaim territory through systemic military pressure. For decades, official reports described atrocities as isolated excesses. However, a 2022 historical study proved the Dutch military utilized extreme violence, including torture and summary executions, as a widespread and tolerated practice. In December 1947, during a raid on the village of Rauwegede, Dutch soldiers executed 431 men and boys without trial. No charges were ever brought against the officers responsible. The conflict resulted in over 100,000 Indonesian deaths, as the military used structural violence to try and hold the colony. By 1949, the military campaign was stalling. Under international pressure, the United States threatened to cut off post-war Marshall Plan aid to the Netherlands unless they negotiated a transfer of power. This economic leverage forced the Dutch to the table. At the Round Table Conference in The Hague, the two sides negotiated the transfer of sovereignty, but the Dutch demanded a final payment. They forced the new nation to assume 4.5 billion guilders of colonial debt for their freedom. This included the military costs of the war. In effect, Indonesia was forced to finance the weapons used to suppress its own independence. The financial extraction was designed to cripple the new nation's economy from its very first day. When the troops returned home, the Dutch government systematically suppressed the history of the conflict, framing systemic violence as accidental incidents. That suppression extended to the people who fought for them. Thousands of indigenous Moluccan soldiers arrived in the Netherlands in 1951, only to be unceremoniously discharged from the army and left stateless. Many of these loyalist families were housed in complete isolation, and in some cases they were placed in former Nazi concentration camps like Westerbork and Vught. This silence held for decades, insulating the Dutch self-image, while the human wreckage and the financial extortion remained hidden from public view. That silence has only recently begun to break. The 2022 decolonization study officially dismantled the narrative of the police actions, documenting war crimes that had been covered up for generations. The findings led to formal apologies for the extreme violence from both the Dutch state and the monarchy. In 2023, the Dutch Prime Minister formally recognized August 17, 1945, as Indonesia's true independent state. This creates a direct legal conflict. If Indonesia was sovereign in 1945, the subsequent 4-year military campaign becomes an illegal occupation of a sovereign state. While the apologies have arrived, the staggering financial and moral debts of colonialism, specifically the extorted billions, remain the true unresolved consequences of the empire.